Beneath the ground of Venezuela lies the largest proven oil reserve on the planet. More oil than Saudi Arabia, more than Canada, more than Iraq. The number sits at roughly 300 billion barrels, enough in theory to power the entire world for years. And yet Venezuela is one of the poorest, most economically broken countries in the Western Hemisphere. Millions have fled. Inflation at one point reached 1,000,000%. Hospitals ran out of medicine. Children went hungry. How does a country sitting on top of the greatest oil treasure in history end up unable to feed its own people? And here is the question Wealth Chronicles exists to ask. While Venezuela collapsed, who was getting rich? Follow the oil. Because when you do, you will find American refineries, American corporations, American consumers, and a geopolitical game of chess that has been playing out for over a century. To understand Venezuela's oil today, you have to understand what it was. In the 1970s, Venezuela was the wealthiest country in Latin America. Oil revenues built highways, universities, and a middle class. Caracas had more skyscrapers than almost any other city in the region. Venezuelans traveled to Miami and New York on shopping trips. It was an oil bonanza. The problem? The wealth was wildly unequal. Oil profits flowed to a small elite and to state coffers. But most Venezuelans remained poor. That inequality became a political bomb. Enter Hugo Chavez, 1999. A fiery military officer turned populist president who nationalized industries, redistributed oil revenue, and built schools and clinics in poor neighborhoods. He called it the Bolivarian Revolution. His base loved him. Washington despised him. At its peak in the late 1990s, Venezuela exported over 3 million barrels of oil per day. And the US was its single biggest customer, importing up to 1.5 million barrels daily. Then Chavez died in 2013. His successor, Nicolás Maduro, inherited the ideology without the charisma and without the high oil prices that had funded everything. What followed was economic catastrophe. Production collapsed. The currency became worthless. The country emptied out, and the US imposed sanctions. Here is something most Americans do not know. For decades, Venezuela did not just sell oil to the United States. It owned refineries inside the United States. Citgo, the refining and gas station brand you have probably seen at petrol stations across America, is the American subsidiary of Venezuela's state oil company, PDVSA. It operates 3 massive refineries in Texas, Louisiana, and Illinois. And those refineries were specifically built and configured to process Venezuela's particular type of crude oil. This is not a small technical detail. It is the heart of why the economic relationship persists, even through sanctions. Venezuelan crude is heavy and sour, thick, dense, high in sulfur. Most refineries cannot process it efficiently. But the Gulf Coast refineries, many of them built or modified specifically for this type of oil, are extraordinarily good at turning Venezuelan heavy crude into gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel. When Venezuela's oil disappears from the market, these refineries have to scramble for alternatives. Canadian oil sands, Mexican heavy crude, Saudi Arabian blends. And alternatives often cost more, require expensive modifications, or simply produce less efficiently. The implication: when US politicians imposed sanctions on Venezuelan oil, American refineries felt real economic pain. American gasoline prices were affected. Jobs at Gulf Coast industrial facilities were at risk. The dependency ran both ways. This is why, even at the height of US-Venezuela tensions under the Trump administration, the US kept granting sanctions waivers to allow certain oil transactions to continue. The economic entanglement was simply too deep to cut cleanly. In 2019, the Trump administration imposed sweeping sanctions on Venezuela's oil sector, the most aggressive economic pressure the U.S. had ever applied to Caracas. The stated goal? Force Maduro from power by cutting off his oil revenue. What actually happened is a masterclass in how oil, the world's most traded commodity, laughs at borders. Venezuela could not sell openly to the U.S. anymore. So it sold to China, which bought at a steep discount, sometimes 30 to 40% below market price, in exchange for keeping Maduro's government financially alive. Venezuela also sold through shell companies, intermediary traders in Malaysia and Singapore, and ships that disabled their GPS transponders to disguise their routes. The oil kept flowing. Meanwhile, the U.S. kept carving out exceptions. Citgo's American refineries needed to keep running. Humanitarian exemptions allowed some transactions. Licenses were quietly granted. And when global oil prices spiked, particularly after Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022, the Biden administration made a dramatic pivot. Washington sent envoys to Caracas. The administration that had vowed to maintain maximum pressure on Maduro was suddenly sitting across a table from his government, discussing oil. In 2022 and 2023, the U.S. progressively loosened sanctions, allowing Chevron, one of America's largest energy corporations, to resume oil production operations in Venezuela. The message was blunt. When American gasoline prices rise and global supply tightens, geopolitical principles become negotiable. Follow the money. Chevron's Venezuela operations produce hundreds of thousands of barrels a day. That oil primarily flows to U.S. Gulf Coast refineries. American consumers benefit from tighter global supply being loosened, and Chevron shareholders benefit from access to one of the cheapest to extract oil reserves on Earth. Let us be very specific about who benefits when Venezuelan oil flows into the American economy. First, Chevron. The company's Venezuela operations, joint ventures with PDVSA, give it access to crude oil at production costs that are among the lowest in its global portfolio. Second, Gulf Coast refinery operators. Companies like Valero, Marathon, and Phillips 66 that operate heavy crude-capable refineries in Texas and Louisiana gain access to a feedstock they are specifically built to process. Their refining margins improve. Their operational efficiency goes up. Their profits follow. Third, American commodity traders and shipping companies. Every barrel of Venezuelan crude that moves involves brokers, traders, insurers, and shippers. The majority of them operating out of Houston, New York, and Geneva. The transaction fees on hundreds of millions of barrels add up to enormous sums. The paradox: the U.S. government publicly condemns Maduro's regime as authoritarian and illegitimate. It has recognized opposition politicians as Venezuela's rightful leaders. And simultaneously, American corporations extract Venezuelan oil under U.S. government licenses, with profits flowing back to American shareholders. Now let us look at the other side of the ledger. Venezuela's oil production has collapsed from over 3 million barrels per day in the late 1990s to barely 700,000 to 800,000 barrels per day by the mid-2020s. The reasons are layered. Chavez gutted PDVSA's professional workforce and replaced it with political loyalists who did not know how to run an oil company. Maduro's government used oil revenue to service political allies rather than reinvest in infrastructure. Sanctions made it harder to access the spare parts and technology needed to maintain aging oil fields, and foreign investors fled. The result? Oil fields that could be producing at world-class levels are pumping at a fraction of their potential. Wells are literally collapsing and being abandoned. One of the most resource-rich nations in history is running on fumes, and the oil revenue that does flow. It does not reach ordinary Venezuelans in any meaningful way. The Maduro government is opaque about how oil proceeds are allocated. Corruption is pervasive. The social programs that Chavez funded with petrodollars have largely collapsed. Venezuela is the most vivid example in modern history of what economists call the resource curse. The paradox where countries rich in natural resources often develop weaker economies, weaker institutions, and worse outcomes for ordinary people than countries with fewer resources. The oil is there. The wealth it generates is real. But it flows outward to American corporations, to Chinese state buyers, to Maduro's inner circle, while the Venezuelan people who sit on top of it get almost nothing. So what is the actual story of Venezuelan oil and the American economy? It is a story about dependency, mutual, uncomfortable, and impossible to fully sever. The U.S. needs Venezuelan heavy crude because its refineries were built for it. Venezuela needs U.S. buyers because they pay the best prices. That economic gravity is stronger than sanctions, stronger than political hostility, stronger than rhetoric. It is a story about how oil money flows upward. The resource is in Venezuela, underground, belonging in theory to the Venezuelan people. But the profits flow to Chevron shareholders in California, to refinery operators in Texas, to commodity traders in Houston, to the Chinese state that buys at a discount. The people who live above the oil see almost none of it. And it is a story about how geopolitical decisions, sanctions, license grants, diplomatic talks are never purely about values or democracy. They are always, at some level, about whose economy benefits and whose corporations profit. Venezuela is not an exception to how global resource economics work. It is the most extreme example of the rule. If this kind of story, following the real money behind the headlines, is why you watch Wealth Chronicles, subscribe now and hit the bell. Next week, we go inside another resource story that almost no one is telling. The rare earth minerals powering your phone and the country that controls them.